Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something pretty interesting. We're going to be looking at Japan's economy today. And trust me, this one's a real head scratcher.
It really is. When you think about it, a country can have an economy that's been basically flatlining for decades, but still, the
Mm.
people there have this incredibly high quality of life. It's almost like a paradox, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It really makes you question some of those assumptions we have about like what makes an economy successful.
for sure. Like, do we just focus on growth? Or should we be thinking about things like well-being and stability as well?
Well, let's see if we can unpack that a bit.
Sounds good.
So the jumping off point for this deep dive is this article called What Happened to Japan's Economy?
Hmm.
And it kind of starts by taking us back a bit, painting a picture of Japan as this like economic superpower.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
They were a force on the world stage, influencing everything from, well, technology, of course, to even, like, pop culture. Think back to those cyberpunk movies, like all the neon lights and that futuristic Tokyo vibe.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean.
That was peak Japan, right? When
Yeah.
their economy and technology were just totally dominating.
It was. Especially in those decades after World War II.
Right.
Japan just went through this period of rapid industrialization. They were coming out with all this cutting edge tech, and they had this, like, seemingly unstoppable work ethic. It's no surprise they became the world's second largest economy and stayed there for quite a while.
Exactly. And here's where things get interesting. There's this major twist. Starting in the late 80s, Japan's economy basically just stalled.
Yeah, pretty much.
In fact, they actually recently lost their position as the world's third largest economy to South Korea. That's a big deal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a pretty dramatic change.
So what in the world happened?
Well, a lot of experts point to this event called the 1985 Plaza Accord. And here's the thing, it was actually meant to help the US. The idea was to make American exports cheaper, but it ended up having some really unintended consequences for Japan.
Wait, so how could something designed to help the U.S. end up hurting Japan?
Okay, so the Plaza Accord was all about, like, manipulating currency values. It weakened the US dollar and made the Japanese yen much stronger. Now think about it this way. If your country's currency suddenly becomes like super strong, all your products overseas, they instantly become way more expensive. It makes it harder to sell anything on the global market.
Oh, okay, I get it. So Japanese products basically became less competitive and their exports took a hit.
Exactly. And on top of that, it triggered this huge speculative bubble in Japan, especially in real estate and the stock market.
Oh, wow.
Investors were pushing prices way up, thinking they were just going to keep going higher.
Hmm.
But the whole thing was built on this, like, really unstable foundation, and, well, you can probably guess what happened next.
The bubble burst.
Yep. It came crashing down, and it really threw Japan's economy into a tailspin. And honestly, they've been trying to fully recover ever since.
Sounds rough. But the article doesn't just stop there, right? It dives into some other factors that might be contributing to this stagnation, like some cultural and structural things, right?
Yeah, it does. It makes this argument that Japan's culture, which really emphasizes perfectionism and avoiding risk, can actually make it harder to innovate and be entrepreneurial. And in today's, fast-paced global economy, those things are super important. It's kind of the opposite of that, what is it, the move fast and break things attitude you see in Silicon Valley.
It's interesting. So a culture that really values precision and planning maybe isn't as quick to adapt when technology is changing so fast.
That's the idea. And the article uses smartphones as an example. I mean, look at how South Korean and Chinese phone brands have become major players globally, right?
Right.
But Japanese companies, they haven't really been able to keep up in that consumer tech space.
Hmm.
It's kind of ironic because they used to be these tech giants.
It is. Are there any other cultural factors that the article mentions?
Yeah, there's one more, the language barrier. Japan hasn't really adopted English as much as some other countries, and that can make it harder to collaborate internationally and attract talent from all over the world, especially in the tech sector, where English is kind of the default language.
Okay, so we've got these economic shocks,
Yeah.
and then we've got these cultural factors all playing a role in Japan's stagnation. But there's another big piece to this puzzle too, right?
You got it.
The whole demographic situation.
Exactly. Japan is dealing with both a shrinking and an aging population. And what that means is that they have fewer and fewer workers to support a growing number of retirees. And that puts a real strain on economic growth.
Right, I've definitely heard about Japan's aging population. What are they doing, like, policy-wise to deal with this,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to like how wealth is distributed.
Well, one thing they've done is implement a pretty significant inheritance tax. It's designed to prevent wealth from getting stuck with a smaller and smaller group of heirs and to try and spread the resources around more fairly.
Makes sense. So we're seeing this picture emerge of Japan. Economic stagnation, cultural barriers, and some pretty serious demographic challenges. It sounds, well, kind of bleak, to be honest. But here's where things get really fascinating and where this whole paradox comes in. Even with all this going on, Japan has somehow maintained a really high quality of life.
Isn't that wild? It really throws a wrench in our typical ideas about how economic growth and well-being are supposed to go hand in hand. It's almost like you're saying, hey, there's more to a good life than just those GDP numbers.
Exactly. So let's dig into that a bit. How are they defying this like conventional economic wisdom? What makes their quality of life so high, even with this lack of growth?
Well, one thing is that they've managed to keep inflation really low, which means people's money goes further. They've also got incredible job security. Like their employment rate is something like 87%. And get this, housing is actually affordable in Japan, even in big cities like Tokyo.
Wow, affordable housing in Tokyo. I mean, you practically never hear that about any other major city in the world. How do they manage that?
It's interesting, right? It's partly because of how they view homes. It's not so much as an investment that you flip for profit, but more as a place to actually live, which helps keep prices from going crazy, unlike those housing crises you see in a lot of other countries.
That's a really interesting point. It does seem like Japan's prioritizing stability and well-being for their people over just constantly chasing growth and, speculation. But don't you need a strong economy to be able to support things like um, public safety and education? How does Japan do that with an economy that's been stagnant for so long?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what makes Japan's story so unique. See, they may not have this skyrocketing GDP growth, but they've chosen to focus on things that don't always get measured in traditional economic analyses. Things like public safety, education, making sure their institutions are really effective. Those are all key parts of a society that's doing well, and Japan's really good at them.
So it's like they're saying, hey, we might not be growing at some crazy rate, but our citizens are safe, they're well educated, and the systems here work. That's got to be worth something,
No,
right?
yeah, absolutely. And it all adds up to this high quality of life that they have, even without this need for constant, rapid economic growth. It suggests that maybe we need to broaden our definition of what a successful economy actually looks like. Maybe we need to look at more than just GDP.
I can see that. Japan's model really does challenge that growth at all costs mentality that we see so much of around the world. It makes you wonder, could Japan's approach, this focus on social well-being and stability, could that be a viable alternative for other developed nations, especially as they deal with things like climate change and rising inequality?
Yeah, that's a conversation we should definitely be having. It could be that putting well-being and sustainability alongside economic growth is a better way to go in the long run.
It certainly gives you a lot to think about. But hey, before we wrap up, I got to ask about this one thing that's always kind of fascinated me. You know that stereotype of Japanese people being total workaholics?
Oh, yeah.
This article actually suggests that might be more fiction than reality these days. Is there any truth to that?
There is. As it turns out, Japanese workers are actually putting in fewer hours per year than a lot of us in the West. So yeah, those images of like totally exhausted salarymen sleeping on trains might be a little outdated.
Wow, really? That's kind of surprising. I guess those late night office scenes you see in Japanese movies are more for dramatic effect than anything else, huh? But hold on, doesn't Japan have an issue with people not reporting all the overtime they work? Wouldn't that make the numbers a little misleading?
You're right, unreported overtime is definitely a thing there, so it makes it tough to do those direct comparisons. It reminds us that data can be complicated, and there are always going to be those little nuances to consider.
True enough. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about Japan's economic stagnation, their cultural and demographic hurdles, and how they've managed to maintain a high quality of life in spite of it all. It's pretty mind-blowing, really.
Yeah, it really flips the script on what we think we know. Japan shows us that economic growth, at least how we usually measure it, isn't the only way to build a successful society.
So thinking back on everything we've talked about, what are some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into Japan's economic paradox?
Well, I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that there's not just one way to be prosperous. Japan's story is a good reminder that economic growth, it's not the only thing that matters when we're talking about how successful a society is. They've really shown that focusing on things like people's well-being, stability, and making sure things are sustainable can lead to a really high quality of life, even without those big, impressive GDP numbers. Yeah, I agree. And it forces us to kind of take a step back and look at our own priorities and what we assume to be true. Like what does a truly successful society look like? Is it all about the economy growing as fast as possible? Or should we be looking at other things too, like how happy people are, how equal things are, and whether we're taking care of the environment?
It's almost like Japan's giving us this sneak peek at what the future could look like for other developed countries.
Yeah.
You know, a future where growth might not be the main goal, but where the focus is on people's quality of life and sustainability. It's definitely something to think about. It could be pretty inspiring, actually.
Yeah, it definitely makes you rethink some things. And sure, Japan has its own problems, of course, every country does. But I think their experience is really valuable. It gives us a new way to think about what a successful society could look like in this century.
Right. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into Japan's economic paradox, I want to leave you with one final thought. Could any of what Japan's doing, their model, could it be applied to other countries that are dealing with similar issues? Things like slow growth, inequality, and climate change. It's a big question, a complex one, but I think it's worth exploring.
It definitely is. We can all learn a lot from what Japan's going through, both the good and the bad. It really encourages us to be critical of our own economic models and what we're aiming for as a society, to think about maybe there are other paths we could take to build a future that's more sustainable and fair for everyone.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Exploring these complicated issues, challenging our assumptions, and hopefully sparking some new ideas. So we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Japan's economy and that it gave you something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.